All right. Well, we are back, and thank you everyone for joining for the later afternoon session of the first day of the 2022 Northern Ontario Ag Conference. If you're attending all of the sessions, you might get a little bit tired of hearing this, but I will just remind everyone that questions can go in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and we will put them to the presenters after their presentation is done. And it's a little bit easier on our end to keep track of all of the questions if they're in that Q&A box rather than the chat function. All of the events in this conference are being recorded and will be put online on the Northern Ontario Farm Innovation Alliance YouTube page after the event is over. So keep an eye on our social media and we will let you know when those videos are available. I would like to thank the Chicken Farmers of Ontario, BioEnterprise Canada Corporation, the Cooperation Council of Ontario, and FedNor and the Government of Canada for sponsoring this conference. This conference is presented in partnership with the Rural Agri Innovation Network, who will be moderating this session. So I will hand things over to you, Dave.
Thanks a lot, Cameron. Good afternoon, everyone. In this session, our speakers are going to be exploring how northern horticulture farms and farms can better plan for pollinators all year round. And we have a few guest speakers who conduct research and farm in northern climates. This session will be useful for anyone planting orchards or producers that want to encourage better pollination with their crops. So first up, we have Jenny Fortier. She is the founder of Northern Wildflowers Incorporated, a producer and retailer of native wildflower seeds based in Sudbury. Jenny's a biologist by training with a master's in science and certificate in sustainable landscape design. She's a master gardener and avid naturalist and mother to two farmers in training. Welcome this afternoon, Jenny.
Thanks. Hi. So so David did a great job just introducing a little bit. I'm not a traditional farmer. I'm an ecologist really by training. So I know a lot more about native plants than I do about farming. But owning this business and growing wildflowers has exposed me to a lot more farming. So we're based in Sudbury. We grow and sell wildflower seed for the retail market as well as bulk clients in the restoration space. In commercial space, we have 7 staff now, and we're growing all the time. It's been a very busy year for us. We also employ 15 wild collectors that help us to collect seed that we may not have in our area or on our collection sites. We now have also 12 contract growers in 5 provinces that grow for us. We developed a proprietary seed coating that is completely biodegradable and eco-friendly and made of plant materials and minerals. And then we're also launching a line of Canadian farmer-grown garden seed this year. So we've been very busy. We're always learning. And so today I'm going to share a little bit with you some of the things that can help you on your farm if you're concerned about pollination and supporting pollinators. So before I start any talk about wildflowers, I always talk a little bit about some of the terminology because there's so much terminology out there and it's kind of confusing. So when I say native plants, it's not always the same thing as wildflowers. So wildflowers are native to somewhere. They may just not be native to our area. So, as a consumer, if you're buying wildflowers or wildflower seed, just check to make sure it's actually native to our area because it's wild somewhere. It just might not be wild here, especially when we're talking about Northern Ontario. We're not a very big market. So most of what you're going to find labeled as a wildflower is really for larger markets, in the central US, and there's a lot of like California stuff in there, but it's not always for us in our area. So what are native plants? So native plants are plants that were here historically, that are adapted and evolved for our climate, for our conditions. They have relationships with the wildlife that we find around here. A native plant, it may not always, so a native plant is not the same as a naturalized plant. So I'm going to use that term a bit. A naturalized plant is a plant that exists here, that was brought here. Most of our naturalized plants were brought during European colonization, but they're not invasive, they're not harmful, they've become part of the environment, but they're not actually strictly native. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And another bit of terminology that sometimes gets confusing is an aggressive plant is not the same thing as an invasive plant. So a lot of folks will say, well, native plants are aggressive, and certainly some of them can be. They just spread quickly and they're really good at what they do. But it doesn't mean that they're invasive. So you have to be careful with the term invasive, because that's usually reserved for plants that do not belong here, that were brought here, and that are causing chaos on an ecosystem of one type. So so we're going to get started. I have a little quiz for you, just to try to make it a bit more interactive, so we're not all just staring at a screen. So you can just sort of answer on your own or in your head to test your knowledge. So native plants cannot be planted with other crops. Do you guys think that's true or false? So that's false. We get questions about that all the time, where folks will go, okay, well, if I'm going to plant natives, I need to convert my entire property. You know, I can't integrate them, and you really can. There's lots of ways to do that, and it's totally possible. So you really don't have to go like overboard and totally remove everything that's there and that sort of thing. Our next question, a garden with native plants will produce more allergens. Whoa, this is really flying through. Sorry, I don't know why that moved ahead. So true or false? So it's false, spoiler alert. It's one of the main sources of allergens for folks is actually grass. It's not flowering forbs most of the time, because their pollen is larger and doesn't aggravate allergies as much as the tiny pollen you'll find in grass. So that's false. Oh, why is it just moving on its own? Okay, so native plants are too aggressive to add to my property. Is someone else controlling the slideshow here? It's just like flying along.
I'm not sure.
No. Okay, I'll try to talk faster. Maybe the computer's telling me to hurry up. Okay, so are native plants too aggressive to add to your property? Will they crowd out your existing plants? And the answer is generally false. It's really about choosing the right species for what you're doing and what you want. If you don't want something that spreads readily, there's lots of options for you. If you do want something that spreads readily, that will stabilize your site, prevent erosion, there's a lot of options there too. So it's not necessarily going to be, no matter what native you choose, it's going to take over. That's not always true. It's just about what you choose and what you want it to do. Okay, yeah, this slideshow is doing weird stuff. So another spoiler alert. So a lot of the plants we're used to seeing are actually naturalized. They're not native. So buttercups are a great example. They're actually native to Europe. We're so used to seeing them. They've been here for a long time. They're not disrupting the environment, but they're not actually native. So if that's something that you're really concerned about, that one's not native. Same with chicory. It's actually one of my favorite plants. It's a really gorgeous fall, blue kind of purple color. That's European. Goldenrod is native. I also have a picture here, an inset picture of ragweed. So goldenrod's gotten a bit of a bad name. A lot of folks confuse it with ragweed and think that it's like this source of tremendous allergens, but it's not. It's actually, doesn't produce any more allergic reactions than any other flowering plant, and it's not related to ragweed at all. They're actually quite different when you see them. But I'll talk a bit about goldenrod. It's a really great plant, really underutilized. Next, fireweed. You've probably seen lots of this in whoa, okay, hold on. I'm gonna have to be more aggressive with this slideshow telling you what to do. So fireweed, we'll see a lot of that in like July and August, all along roadsides. That's another beautiful native, really great for flying insects. So why care about native plants? Well, there's lots of reasons. Whether you're a home gardener, a market gardener, a farmer, there's lots of reasons native plants can be great. So they provide habitat for wildlife. So that's something that a lot of folks are more concerned about these days. They can be easier to maintain and cheaper to maintain. So because they're adapted to our climate and our conditions, they often don't require a lot of watering. They don't often require a lot of inputs of, chemicals or additions to your soil. They often compete quite fine with other things, so you don't need to intervene as much. They can be a lot more resistant to pests and competition. Again, because they're adapted to the pressure we have here from our native pests. They can increase surrounding plant biodiversity. So when you've got a seed bank of a native plant, you're really creating a source of that plant for an area, that goes further than just your property. And I'm going to talk a bit more about these last 2 points that are maybe more relevant to farms. Is they can be a great means of natural pest control, and they can increase your farm yields. So there's so much buzz about pollinators, and maybe these facts are common knowledge now. That would be great if they were, but for anyone who needs a reminder, pollinators are so important. There's over 200,000 species of pollinators out there, and it's not just bees. It's wasps and birds and butterflies and ants, and there's a whole giant group of animals that play that role. And 90% of the plants that we deal with commercially need pollinators. So 90% of them are not wind pollinated. They're pollinated by something that flies, walks, crawls, yeah, I think that flies, walks, crawls, runs, maybe they run. And that value, that pollinator service is valued at $1.2 billion per year in Canada alone. And so the reason we can put a value on that service is there are places in the world where pollinators are no longer there. There's orchards in Asia where workers go out with paintbrushes and they pollinate every blossom on every tree in the orchard, and it costs a small fortune. And we really don't want to be there. So all the more reason to be thinking about these things in our planning. And so when I say that native plants and pollinators and wildlife, they have these, relationships, they can be really quite complex, and they're things that take a really long time to develop. They're not things you're going to find with plants that are not familiar to pollinators. And this is a really great example here. I've got the flower pictured here is a wild bergamot, or a monarda. So it's a member of the mint family. You can make an Earl Grey tea out of it. It's just super, super aromatic. And so the flowers on this plant are these deep, they're these deep flowers that are really easily accessible to hummingbirds, to long-tongued bees, to hummingbird moths, but they're not very well accessible to a lot of other pollinators. So what happens with these flowers is they're pollinated by that group of pollinators, but wasps also come along and they use their strong, cutting mouth parts, and they cut a hole at the base of the flower to let the nectar seep out, and then they collect nectar that way. And once that happens, a whole suite of other pollinators like sweet bees and carpenter bees come in, and they also lap up that nectar, and that becomes sort of this cycle that you see in these flowers, where these different groups of pollinators make their way through in that sequence. So I had mentioned one of the great benefits of native plants is an integrated pest control. So what you're doing when you're planting native plants on an area of your farm is you're creating a magnet for adult insects. So generally it's the adult insects that feed on nectar. And once they're there, they're going to lay their eggs, and there's a lot of really great natural pest control insects whose larvae feed on some of the pests we don't like. So for example, adult ladybugs will be attracted to nectar sources, but it's their larvae. So you hope that they lay their eggs nearby when you have native plants. Their larvae will eat all kinds of pests like aphids. Same thing with parasitic wasps. Their larvae will eat. They'll lay their eggs on the eggs of lots of caterpillars that can be pests in the garden. So like tomato worms and cabbage worms. Same thing with hoverflies. So these are all really great insects to have around to help control populations of some of the pests we don't want on our farm. And you can attract them by having those plants that the adults like, and then the adults will choose to lay their eggs nearby. Another great one are praying mantises. They're generalists. They're just going to eat whatever insect is around. So, you know, so they're going to take some of the good insects too. But in general, the consensus is they do really help to control populations when there's a boom of a pest. Same with this hoverfly. Same thing. Their larvae will parasitize the caterpillars of different butterflies and moths that are harmful in our farms. So the next I wanted to show a wasp, because a lot of people don't know that wasps can be really beneficial, and I'll give you some tricks to dealing with wasps. So first thing to know is adult wasps actually feed on nectar. A lot of people don't know that. So they're a pollinator, and they're an important pollinator. What they do is they kill insects and cut them up into little insect pieces to feed to their larvae. So it's their larvae that are exclusively carnivores, but the adults feed on nectar. And so having them around, they're a great pollinator. They're going to kill a lot of insects, feed them to their larvae. And if you don't want wasps to bother you in the fall, because right, that's when they get really irritating, is the trick is to have lots of nectar sources around. The reason they bug us in the fall, it's actually quite interesting. So when these adult wasps bring food to their larvae, the larvae want the meat and they need the adults to bring it to them. They actually produce this sugary substance that they reward the adults with when the adults feed them. And the adults feed on that and nectar a lot of the summer. And then in the fall, when the queen sort of stops making a lot of these larvae, because it's time for everything to sort of settle down, they start to just, you know, go a little like sugar crazy because they're missing this source of sugar. So if you have nectar sources, especially fall nectar sources around, you're not going to see wasps bother you as much. Really, you know, you see them a lot in the city where, you know, they're living in places where there's like sugary trash and stuff around, and there's no source of sugar otherwise. But if you do that, you'll see that wasps are not going to bother you as much, and they really are an important pollinator, even though we kind of love to hate them. So if you're trying to attract the right pollinators, and really you can attract a whole suite of them, they don't just have to be the ones who control pests. It's really about the floral color and shape. Those are the things, those are kind of the lock and key that you need to get the right pollinators. So they're co-adaptive. So a pollinator is adapted to be able to get to the nectar in the flowers it pollinates. And that's what's called the pollinator syndrome. So in this diagram, you'll see, you know, there's tubular flowers, there's flowers with shallow nectaries, there's flowers with lots of nectaries, there's flowers with big landing pods. So they're all sort of adapted for whoever's pollinating them. And in this example, I've got a cardinal flower. And so this is a beautiful native with these deep flowers, and they're red. So if you want to guess, this one's easy. So this is primarily pollinated by hummingbirds. You know, they're deep nectaries, so a hummingbird can get to it. Hummingbirds are attracted to red. Bees actually don't see red. So if you're trying to attract and support bees, red isn't always the best color, but it does attract birds. We've got some scarlet bee balm, some bleeding hearts, and some wild columbine, all great nectar sources that are adapted to be pollinated by birds. Next, we've got a purple coneflower. So if you look at it, there's this big solid landing pad that's very obvious. And these are adapted to being pollinated by butterflies and moths. So butterflies and moths need to land to get the nectar out of a flower. So they need somewhere heavy, you know, that can support them. And then they've got these long tongues. So these are compound flowers where there's little nectar, little, you know, wells, you know, there's hundreds of them in every flower. And so these butterflies have long tongues to get to that. This one's just for fun. You're not going to grow this on your farm. But Jack in the Pulpit's a really interesting ecological example. So this flower has a spade shape. And it actually smells like fungus. And that's because its pollinator is a little tiny fly called a fungus gnat. And they're attracted to the fungus smell because they think it's food, they think it's a fungus. And they make their way in and they bobble around a male flower and they get covered in pollen. And there's a little escape chute, a little tiny hole at the bottom that they get out of. And of course, because they're flies, they fly along and they forget that happened, and they do it again to another flower until they eventually get to a female flower, which, by that point, they're often covered in nectar, and they pollinate that flower, but then there's no escape chute. So they actually get stuck in there. This is not like a great example of both benefiting, I guess, because oftentimes these flies end up getting entombed in the flower. So if you've ever seen Jack in the Pulpit seeds, they look like little red corn kernels. They're full of these flies that are just embalmed and entombed in them. So it's a really interesting co-adaptation, and these Jack in the Pulpit really need the fungus gnats, or else they're just not being pollinated by anybody. Okay, and then we've got here a marigold. So a big, obvious yellow flower, big landing pad. And this is a perfect flower for pollination by bees. Bees really like yellow, white, purple, and blue flowers. Those are the colors that they like the most. And so this is a great example, bumblebees, honeybees, sweet bees, any bee out there will really like this type of flower. And our last one, we've got some yarrow here. And so yarrow is a really great example of a shallow flower. So the nectar is really close to the top, and there's compound flowers. So there's all these flowers all together. So a really big source of nectar with nice shallow flowers. And these are the type of flowers you're going to see pollinated by a lot of our pest management allies that I talked about. A lot of those wasps, ladybugs, tachinid flies, they don't always have the most specialized mouth parts for getting to deep nectar, but these type of flowers are perfect for them and will do wonders in attracting them. Okay, and the other great advantage to growing natives on your farm is that they will increase your yield. So having more pollinators around means that just everything will get pollinated better. And so, you guys all already know a lot of the things that need to get pollinated can self-pollinate. And in years when there's, a lot of rain and pollinators don't get out very well, or, if there's a period where there's not a lot of pollinators on your farm, and you see a lot of things that are self-pollinated, you're going to see smaller fruit, you're going to see less fruit. And so that's not what we want. We want, real pollination. We want most of the flowers on our plants to get pollinated. And so having more pollinators around will increase the yields of everything around that needs to be pollinated. So really anything that isn't wind pollinated will benefit from having more pollinators around. And there's, now it's going backwards. There's, so many studies showing the increase in yields that you see when you have more pollinators around, from, everything to squashes to berries. So which natives? So really, any nectar source is good, right? So whatever you want to grow, if it's providing nectar, that's better than not providing nectar. And then it just goes into like levels of what's like a little better and a little better. So natives really are a good choice because they're going to be perennial, and they're the ones with these great relationships, right? And then if we dig even deeper, we can look at some of the natives that are really the best at attracting these beneficial insects. So members of the aster family, so the yarrow I mentioned, chamomile is a great ornamental that's also a member of the aster family. And of course, all kinds of native asters. We have, blue asters, we have New England asters, we have so many asters, and they're very easy to grow, and they're very, very popular with the types of insects we're talking about. There it goes again. Goldenrods. I know that a lot of people see them as weeds, but they are such a great plant. They're so easy to grow. They improve the soil quality. They produce nectar right into, they're the latest nectar source as far as wildflowers go. Members of the mint family, some of your bergamots, hyssops, mints, flowers that have an umbel shape like fennel, carrots, parsley are popular as well with those groups of pollinators. And then some other noteworthy examples are some of our wild sunflowers, poppy mallows, vetches, lobelias, and milkweeds. Something to keep in mind with milkweeds, though, is they are toxic to livestock. So you want to, just put some thought into those if you've got livestock on your farm. And so I'm sure that, this isn't new to anyone, but the main way you can do this, the easiest way, is just putting in strips of wildflowers. They don't have to be very big, a meter wide by however meters long you can go, sort of straddling your crops, separating crops, however you want to do it will go a long way in attracting a lot more pollinators to your property. And when we look at design, some of the considerations to think about are, do you want a nice, neat looking kind of English garden look where you've got clumps of different species, or do you want them mixed in along with some native grasses for more of a meadow look? And so either are good options, but there's some considerations. So if you're growing in clumps, it can be a bit more weeding for you because you're removing anything you don't want there. But the clumps are a little bit better for pollinators because they do visit one crop type per pollination trip. So if you've got a nice clump of the same flower, they're just going to be more effective at pollinating. So that's a benefit, but it can be more maintenance, like I said. Whereas the meadow, because you've got some grasses mixed in there, will be a lot less maintenance. And it's going to give you, maybe a bit of a wilder look too, if that's what you're looking for. Other things to consider, we get this all the time where folks really, hope because they're wildflower seeds that they can just sprinkle them on top of the existing vegetation, and like anything else you grow from seed, that's not going to work. You've got to remove what's there, loosen the soil to get the site ready for seeding. Think about if you want to have some wildflowers on your property, do you want to do it by seed or plugs? Plugs can be great because they'll get you flowers sooner, but it will be a lot more costly. Seed you can do in larger areas, but it does take longer. If you're going to seed, generally that's done in the fall with our native wildflowers. That's just their natural time to go to seed, and then they need to overwinter for the most part before they'll germinate. You want to consider if you're going with a mix or some plants, you want to make sure that you've got species that have spring flowers, species that have summer, and species that have fall, so that you can have what we call a continuous nectar source, so that you're supporting pollinators all through spring, summer, and fall. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. A great mix to look for is a mix that's 70% wildflowers. Oh, here it goes. That's 70% wildflowers and 30% grasses. You do want a bit of native grass in there if you're doing a mix, if you're doing a meadow look, because grasses want to be there. They're part of filling in the space. And if you put the grass that you want in there, you're in good shape. If you don't put any grass in there, you're going to do a lot of weeding because grass will make its way and it just won't be the grass you want. So a 70-30 mix for pollinators is ideal. You've got a lot more flowers and grasses, but you still have some grass there. And another consideration is a lot of species of our native wildflowers are super long-lived. And so you may not get a lot of flowers the first year. You'll get a few more the next year, and then the third year onward, you'll really see things really get big and develop. So it can be a little different if you're used to growing, annuals or whatnot. It does take a bit longer, but they are long-lived, so it's worth the investment that way. So when we talk about planning for a continuous nectar source, some good options for you. So for spring and summer, your biggest assets are having native trees and shrubs nearby. Those are, nature's source of nectar first thing after, first thing in the spring when winter's ending. Those are, your native maples and all kinds of fruit-bearing shrubs are the ones that are providing most of the nectar for pollinators. Other great options are, lilacs, borage, your fruit trees. I know we love to hate dandelions, but they are an early nectar source. Wild columbine is another great one. In the summer, that won't be a problem. There's so many nectar sources in the summer, and any mix you have will have lots of varieties that flower in the summer. And then in the fall, you'll want to be a bit more conscious of that. to make sure you've got some asters, some goldenrods. Native sunflowers will produce nectar into the fall. And then again, there's a whole variety of native trees and shrubs that will produce nectar and then seed later in the season. So that's a good sort of summary of some of the things that will help you with having a continuous nectar source. And that takes us to the end of my chat here about wildflowers and pollinators. Thank you for hanging in there with our technical issues with the slideshow. I hope it wasn't too confusing, but I'm assuming we have time for questions now.
Yeah, we'll go to a few questions here, Jenny. And one of the questions was that there's been some concerns that draining wetlands where insects lay larvae is having a negative impact on pollinators. Have you heard this or have any insights or advice how to mitigate that if that's the case?
So I mean, yeah, like draining a wetland would have lots of negative impacts on lots of wildlife. That's for sure. Yeah, you get a lot of flying insects that have their larval stages, you know, in fresh water. And so, yeah, I mean, for sure, that could be an issue for pollinators as well as lots of other wildlife. Generally, you know, on larger projects, where, you know, there's really a significant impact, there will be a mitigation strategy. Well, there'll be, you know, a requirement to set up, you know, I don't remember the terminology. It's something like, you know, replace the habitat somewhere else, like to create those conditions somewhere else. I'm not an expert in that field, but yeah, certainly that would have an impact on pollinators and lots of other things. Yeah.
Just one question I had, some yield benefits you cited for vegetables. Are there any other yield benefits for like legume crops, like alfalfa, from planting native wildflowers?
I would assume, I mean, the studies I was looking at were more focused on market gardens, but I would assume, I mean, anything that's not wind pollinated would benefit from either, you know, pollination or just from having those insects around that are going to take care of some of your pests. So I would assume it applies to those crops too.
And to follow that up, I guess, would there be any, I guess, issues with persistence of the native plants to be in competition with other plants if they were seeded into like a pasture?
So in terms of persistence, when you plant native plants, you're sort of planting them assuming they're staying there, you know, because they're perennial. So, you know, they're going to come back after a season, and a lot of them are deep rooted. So you really want to consider that when you're planting, that you're doing it for a long term. It's not to say you can't remove them, but you know, they're perennial. So you're going to have to dig them up, and you know, you might have some come back and that sort of thing. Yeah.
One more question here is, where's the best place to source seeds? I guess this would be for native plants.
I know a place, so we can get seeds for you. So that's what we do at Northern Wildflowers. We grow and sell wildflower seed. So we, you know, grow them on our farm in Whitefish. So they're, you know, regionally adapted and all that stuff. There's also, it can be harder if you're looking for plants to find plants, but I would just encourage, if you want plants, to talk to your local nursery and let them know that you want native plants, because it's important for them to know that, you know, there's demand if they don't have any. We also really like Ontario plants, so onplants.ca, which is in Southern Ontario, but they ship plants Canada-wide, and they do a really good job at it. So those are some good options for plants, and we're, you know, a great local seed supplier as well.
Okay. Are there many protected native plants in our region?
There's a few, yeah, there's a few. Yeah, they're not, you're not going to be getting seed from any of these locally, you know, rare guys for the most part. But there's definitely a few. You can take a look at Ontario Species at Risk website to see if you're within the native range of any of these populations. But there's, yeah, just like animals that are at risk, there's also plants that are at risk. There's quite a few more in southern Ontario than there is in the north. The Carolinian forest has lots of plants at risk, but there are some in northern Ontario as well. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. There's just one more question here. Is there a flower to grass ratio, or is there?
Yeah, we recommend 70-30 if your goal is to attract pollinators. The thing to think about too is your budget, because the wildflower seed is going to cost you a lot more than the grass seed. So we tell people, that's your ideal ratio. But if you wanted to try, if you're trying to work with a limited budget, then you can decrease that ratio of wildflower seed and have more grass. So you could go like 50-50 grass to wildflowers, or you could go like 40-60. It's better than, not having any. But you can kind of, if you've got a seed supplier who really understands their product, you can play with those ratios to get it to, where you want to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So stick around, Jenny. We might have some more questions here as we go into Bob's presentation. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bob Bors. And Dr. Bors is with the University of Saskatchewan and is where he's joining us from today. And he's been a professor in the plant science department there since 1999. He teaches a range of different topics in horticulture, and he's going to be covering the importance of good pollination with compatible pollen and overlapping blooms for planting orchards. And so we're happy to welcome Dr. Bob Bors back as a speaker from when he spoke with Algoma Farms back in 2014 about northern hardy fruit production. So welcome, Bob. We'll try to get, if you could share your screen there, if your presentation, get that up.
Okay. Let's get this out. Okay. I'm not sure what screen it's doing.
Yeah, it should be at the bottom panel there that says share screen. It's in green.
I have 3 screens, so it's trying to
find the right one.
No, that's not.
There we go.
Is that doing it? Okay.
Yeah, we see it now.
All right. And that's off to the side. So anyway, so I'm going to talk about planning for pollination. I first want to mention we grow lots of different fruit crops in Saskatchewan, and most of these, there's 2 or 3 on here we don't grow. But in my program, I'm mainly doing haskap and some hazelnuts, apples, cherries, and a lot of these other crops on a much smaller basis. We're the northernmost fruit breeding program in Canada, and little X's are where canceled programs are. Guelph has some breeding going on, but we're the northernmost one, probably more similar to your climate. And my background is we have about 50 acres of fruit, and this is just sort of a map of what's going on. But here's the sequence for the talk is planning for pollination, and the first part is the importance of good pollination. When pollination happens, embryos are formed in the plant, which then start producing growth hormones. And those growth hormones signal to the rest of the plant that it needs nutrition to grow seeds and also the fruit flesh. So if you have a crop that has many seeds or embryos per fruit, they all have to be pollinated for normal fruit development. Otherwise, the fruit flesh doesn't grow properly. So here's an example on Haskap. The pollinated berries are in the center, but the little ones off to the side, those are ones that didn't get pollinated. They might live for a few days before they drop off. Haskap is a weird little plant in that it has 2 flowers per berry, and they tend to open on different days. So you can get a scenario where this one open one is pollinated one day and this one doesn't get pollinated. And what happens is in this picture, these are all from the same plant. And these 2 crescent-shaped ones are ones that one flower got pollinated, but the other one didn't. So you have a half moon. And this one in the middle actually only had 1 seed in it. So the whole berry was smaller. If you grow strawberries, you might see something like this once in a while, poorly pollinated. These are the seeds that set, but these are the little ones that didn't set. So you get misshapen fruit with strawberries. Doesn't happen that much in tree fruits, but here's a pear on the right that only had some of its seeds pollinated. And so one side of the pear never grew. Of course, if you're growing a stone fruit and only has 1 seed, well, your pollination is going to be really poor. You'll drop fruit for everyone that didn't get pollinated. But generally speaking, if you're comparing large fruits with tree fruits with small fruits, the tree fruits usually produce more flowers than needed. So, and some commercial guys will actually go out and thin the number of fruits and to improve fruit size and stabilize yield each year. So you can have lower levels of pollination for tree fruits. But small fruits like berries, cherries, grapes can usually handle it if all the fruit is pollinated, so you don't need to thin them. So in those, higher levels of pollination are needed to get you your higher yields. So the next thing to consider for planting is whether you have varieties that have compatible pollen, right? And I tell my students, if I ask you if a fruit is self-incompatible, just guess that's it and you'll be right most of the time. All these fruits need 2 different varieties that are compatible in order to produce something. There's Haskap, pears, plums, apples, plums, sea buckthorn, lots of them. There's only a handful of fruits that are self-compatible that you only need 1 variety. And some of those are very popular, like grapes, strawberries, raspberries, cherries, right? And less famous maybe are Saskatoons, Aronia, and Gojis. But actually 4 on the list, 4 of these that are self-compatible may have mutations. It's not the general case for blueberries and Haskap and black currants to be self-compatible, but a few are. And in the case of grapes, strawberries, and raspberries, breeders over the generations have selected plants that are self-compatible. But if you got wild versions of these, they might not be. So in our program, we test for cross compatibility by hand to see if our varieties will meet with each other and form fruit. And that's important in choosing our varieties. But hand pollination is not a reliable test of pollination. It's better to have it in a farm situation with 2 varieties near each other. But so the results from a university test might be more conservative than you might find better pollination in the farm. So we made this chart of our own varieties of what receives the pollen, what is the source of pollen. A common misconception is that there's a pollinator variety and the main crop, but most crops pollinate each other. You'll get fruit off your pollinator source. So yeah, this is just chart showing that most are compatible, but indigo gem by indigo gem is not compatible, and there's some that are not. I took this off an Mafra website. Somebody has done it with some Japanese plums. I suspect a lot of these are older varieties. I don't know if it's been done recently, but they would show on this side, if you're growing, say, early golden, well, it's not compatible with itself, but it's compatible with all other varieties. But Shiro doesn't get along with early golden. So you might look at your own Mafra websites. Certainly, I know they have it for plums, maybe for apples. Now, this is a study done in Russia or Poland, I forget which. And these are actually Haskap families, but they're from different breeding programs that tended to use the same parents. And they found that if they had varieties from one breeding program and crossed it with another breeding program, they got very good set. But if they pollinated within the same family from the same program that tended to use similar parents, they got very poor pollination by using closely related things. So that could be a clue if you don't have a pollination chart. Did you get the variety from the same breeding program? Are they closely related? You might know that it would work well if they're not closely related. But compatibility is one thing, but having overlapping bloom is another. They could be compatible, but if they bloom at different times, it won't work. So this is just a chart of one of our projects of different selections having different peak bloom. So in 1 year, they were all blooming these 4 time periods, spaced out quite a bit. The next year, they had some that bloomed as late as June 3rd was their peak bloom. So it's just to show you that there's variability in when their peak bloom is. This was another study that showed the start and ending of bloom, and they found that there were 3 different groupings. There was early, mid, and late blooming varieties, and some of them had really long blooming periods. So that, like this, whatever that variety is, that are these that bloomed a long time, those might be good pollinator varieties. They also studied pollen production, and the best had 20 times more pollen than the worst. So there could be a quality to your pollinator varieties. Here's some of our Haskap varieties. We were basically looking per 10%, estimating how many flowers were open. So it's interesting that some were blooming later on May 24th, but most were not. Some were a lot of them were blooming early. I think I did a little summary here. Indigo gem, the first to bloom, would not be good to plant with Boreal Beauty because none of these early flowers would get pollinated and none of these late flowers on this one get pollinated. But if you had some of the one in between, it would be all right. It is, of course, interesting to see that Tundra in 2 different fields had different response. So maybe these were a warmer field or something and didn't bloom as late. On May 16th, all varieties overlap, so maybe it wasn't that important for overlap. Bloom overlap happens a little less overlap in a cold spring that warms up gradually, it spaces them out. But if it's a late bloom and everything warms up, they tend to merge. So this is something on our website about that. But spring weather can influence bloom. You could have gradual warming, delaying bloom, fast warming, blooming altogether, and flowers don't last as long. On a really fast warming spring, you might get poor pollination because bees have much more choice to go to. Maybe I remember going out one day and all the pears were full of bees and the bees weren't going anywhere else. Rain can result in poor pollination if it overlaps with bloom. And then suddenly cold and suddenly hot changes things. Generally, it's nice to have narrow your risk if you have early, mid, and late varieties. Another thing is young plants bloom earlier than old ones, probably because the soil warms faster and larger plants catch more snow. So I know I've been saying one of my varieties is a really late bloomer, Boreal Beauty, but that's on the larger plant that's catching more snow. The same variety, of course, can bloom at different times in different fields. So I kind of made this chart trying to average whether they're compatible and what the peak bloom can vary. And so I say good, bad, poor, okay. A lot of the ones okay will be good almost all years, but maybe something is out of whack. But okay, so the next big part is having a good orchard plan, right? If you just have a backyard situation with a few plants, I say if you can easily see the two plants, probably the bee can see the two different plants also, right? But don't put one variety in the front yard and one variety in the backyard and expect good pollination. But if you've done your research and you know which compatible varieties or which varieties are compatible, then you have to come up with a good planting plan. And growers are mainly trying various strategies, not based on any research, especially with Haskap, but a lot of our bush fruits, there's actually been no research on it. If you go on the web, you'll find lots of extension publications and internet sites giving recommendations, but no mention of research that was done, or not even what crop the research was done. And they will often say details on ratios, and there's no justification on it. But growers are mainly growing solid rows of varieties, and some of them are trying different ratios if they do it, for all the way from half one variety to half another to a 9-to-1 ratio. The main reason is somebody told them. Some saw it on a farm, and only a few farmers have actually said their planting plan is based on research. And of course, pollination might look good on a farm, but what varieties were they using? Were they using the same ones you're going to grow? So here's the most common strategy, just planting solid rows. It makes it easy to pick because all those plants will ripen at the same time. But it may not be the best strategy for good pollination. You could go so far if you like one variety a lot more than others. You could plant 2 rows of one variety and 1 row of another, right? All varieties are next to a different variety, even though there's more rows of this light green variety. You could do pollinators in every row, and I've seen recommendations for 1 in every 5 or 6 plants. I guess this is a 1-to-6 ratio, but also you might stagger it, right? So by not having them exact spot, that might be a little better pollination. On the other hand, it might be easier to pick the ones if they're all in the same row. So here's a little bit of research that was done in Quebec with Haskap. And it recommends putting pollinators in the rows. And most Quebec growers are totally ignoring this recommendation. But I thought I'd show you the main chart. So they had 3 different farms that were showing mixed varieties in the same row versus pure varieties. So for some reason at this one farm, the pure variety rows did better. Maybe they were on the edge of the woods or closest to the hive or something, but that was kind of not understood why that would happen. But this other farm that had 2 years of data, their mixed rows had twice as much fruit as the pure rows. So that's a huge difference. And a third farm, they got, it looks like maybe 33% higher yield by having pollinators in the rows. So these two farms, it really shows a huge difference. The 9-to-1 ratio, this is how some farms were doing that. And they had one row where it's every third plant, but then solid rows. And that might be a good strategy to try out at the beginning to determine if you're going to plant a lot of acreage in the future, do a few rows mixed like that and a few solid rows and see if it really pays off. But I asked some entomologists at my university, where can I find this original research? And they told me to go to University of Guelph, which I'm a graduate from there, from J.B. Free from 1960. He had written this tome of reviewing 205 research papers about pollination, but it was pollination of fruit trees, not fruit bushes. And so here's some of the highlights of that thing. Apples can have 2 to 6 rows of the same varieties, but plums had 2 to 3 times more fruit if they were next to a pollinator plant. They said when bees visit different varieties, the pollen probably lasts for only a few flowers. So if they stay on the same bush, they're not really cross-pollinating as well. They found that people had researched certain varieties, and the main reason bees would like one variety over another is either how much that it had more nectar or had more pollen. And they didn't really find an importance for the color or the scent of the flower. They had one plum that was visited 3 times more than other plums, and they found it had a lot more nectar. So if you don't know what varieties to plant because you don't know the compatibility, what are you going to do? Are you going to do all these things on this list, gathering pollen to make cross-pollination, investigate breeding lines, DNA analysis, buy plants from different places? No, or this other stuff? No, here's an idea of what you could do on your farm. You might just plant a solid row of your variety you really want to grow, and then every few plants, plant a different pollinator plant, and then just look at the yields around the pollinator plants. You know, if it really likes this, if this is the best pollinator, these 2 bushes in it should have the best yield. And you might even be able to just eyeball it and look at it, right? So that would be one pollination trial for a grower. Another thing you could try, maybe after you've identified which is the best pollinator, plant them really far apart in a row and see if it makes, how far down the row it makes for good pollination. Does the yield go down after 5 or 6 plants? So a little bit more about this document by Free. They found that honeybees tend to stay gathering the same species for a trip. So they're not going to visit your apples and then randomly decide to go to a dandelion and then go to a raspberry or something. They're going to stay on the same plant, and they tend to be in the same 100 meters. And depending on if the pollen or nectar increases or decreases, they might change their strategy and go somewhere else. So during one trip, 71% visited the same tree, only 1/4 of them visited 2 trees, and 5% visited 3 or more trees. Honeybees switched rows twice as much when they were only 10 feet apart rows compared to 15-foot rows. So row distance could be important. So one of the things I thought to experiment with was having double rows of different varieties. And of course, the challenge is going to be whether we can harvest between the rows. If you had double rows, theoretically, you get higher yield because you'd have more fruit per acre, more plants per acre, and also they would be right next to a pollinator plant. So And depending on your harvester, if you knew what harvester you were going to use, if you're using a harvester, if you're doing hand picking, it would be very easy. You would space it so that part of the harvesting machine can fit between the rows when they grow up. We have a sideways harvester, so I don't know if our sideways harvester will be able to take on a whole bush. So we're actually planting solid rows and changing the rows. This is our plantings. They've been 2 years, and we have all one variety on one side and different varieties on the other. And when they get a little taller, we'll see if our machine can harvest those. So we don't know if that's a workable system. It would be workable for a U-pick. We certainly think yields will increase, and we only did 0.5 meter apart. But there's going to be weed control, and we've got wood chips between the close rows. So in my opinion, I think the best planting option would be having a double row. The next best would be planting compatible rows varieties within the same row, but it would be okay if you had solid rows that were interspersed with compatible varieties in alternating rows. I think I'm going really fast, but I think Jenny ended a little early. But I did have some additional concepts from this article on pollination of fruit trees that I thought were kind of interesting. So bees working on hedges stay in the same row. Only 11% of bees switched rows during a visit, and dwarf apples visit only 2 trees next to each other before returning home. So they had different size apple trees to work on, so they were visiting too. These were recommendations for different studies based on tree fruits, but not bushes. And that was the idea. Every 3rd plant and every 3rd row is a pollinizer. That's the most common recommendation. Every 3rd plant in every row. So that's a 1-to ratio. And Dr. Free, I don't know if he was a doctor, but Mr. Free, he recommended for tree fruits every 3rd plant in every row. So 1-to-5 ratio. So they also found that pollen can be spread indirectly. That bees with overlapping forage areas can spread each other's pollen. So if they visit the same flower, they might get pollen out of it again. Or the pollen can be loosely around inside the hives. So that may be another source of cross-pollination. I know it wasn't part of his article, but I saw an invention somewhere of something you can fit to a hive that will make the bees drop a little more of their pollen as they enter the hive and spread it a little bit. Scattering colonies in an orchard gives more uniform pollination, but it's best to place your hives protected from the wind, but where the sunshine is going to happen. So usually your wind is from the north somewhere. But if you have your hives on the south side of some plants where they're going to get that sun warming them up, they'll go to work earlier. If you have a short bloom time crop, you want to move your bee and you're moving hives around, you should move your hives into where it's flowering. Because if you bring them in and there's no flowers, the bees might find a new place to go off to away from your orchard. But if you have extended blooming crops, like if you're planting the wildflowers that Jenny talks about, and they're already blooming, then you can move your bees in there. One researcher mentioned having 6 hives a 1/4 mile apart in some fruit orchards, which I thought that was odd. I don't know how they did this, but they studied watched bees in different kinds of weather to find out how far they'd go. So in good weather, honeybees tended to go about 200 meters, but some of them went as far as 400 meters, and very few went beyond. But in bad weather where it was cold and windy, they tended to only go 60 meters away and would tend to be on the less windy sides of the bushes. So I guess if that kept up, it might be, you know, if you had your bushes going north or east and west, maybe they'd all pollinate the southern half of your bushes. On cherries, when it was 10 to 15 degrees Celsius out, they only went 120 meters and less flowers visited per trip. And they also found heavier crops near hives. Other bees compared to honeybees, bumblebees and solitary bees are less methodical. They're less likely to stay in the same row or stay on the same plant. They switch trees more often. They prefer upper parts of trees. And I know there's been several ones about bumblebees. They're much more efficient pollinators. One bee can pollinate a lot more plants. And you can rent or buy bumblebee hives. I think they're $200 to $300 or so. That might be good for your orchard. Honeybees tend to gather either pollen or nectar on a trip. They're not going for both at the same time. And yeah, I already mentioned the preferences, but their preferences change during the day. In the morning, they're more like a flower is more likely to have more nectar, so bees are looking for the nectar plants. But later in the day, when it warms up, the pollen gets shedded, so bees may switch to pollen hunting in the afternoon. So it's a good idea to have both kinds, I guess. For more website information about my fruit program, fruit.usas.ca is a portal for that. I've written a book on growing fruit in northern gardens, which I'm trying to get on Amazon again. And at the end, are there any questions? I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, we had a few questions here, Bob. Is University of Saskatchewan doing anything specific to attract, promote, or protect early season wild bees for HASCAP?
No, I don't know that. There's somebody in Regina who's been doing a lot of bees research. And I know he was talking about some of the ideas that Jenny brought up about having like a little island of pollination for wild bees. But I don't know that they're doing research on that. But then I'm not in that loop. I'm in the plant sciences department.
Okay. Another question is, what cue or sense is getting bees to the plants in the first place? That is there something that you can plant that is an attractant to get them into orchard or specific rows? And for example, mature trees versus younger trees or shrubs?
Well, first of all, if you're in northern Ontario, you're probably surrounded by boreal forest, which is a great place to have dozens of bee species. I know some of our orchards that are near on the boreal forest in Saskatchewan, our bee guy found like something outrageous, like 35 different pollinator species. So that's a thing. I do wonder, like we had people that planted our cherries that notice that they bloom for a few years, but don't get pollinated very well. And I wonder if that's because the bees haven't found them yet. I know in hedgerows, like windbreaks, it's recommended not to do fancy pruning of them, leave a lot of dead branches, because some of the wild bees will make habitat in old dead wood, right? Or in the ground around it. So that's something. We have a Carigana hedge at the university that blooms after most of our fruit crops are done. And there's probably a lot of wild bees in there.
Just a question for me. like we've seen with the changing climate in our area that it would make new orchard development more conducive, like in Algoma, Manitoulin region. Could you provide any recommendations for producers that are kind of getting started in those initial stages in terms of extension or knowledge? I know you shared your website, but is there anything else there, Bob, that would be of interest to them?
Well, I usually say stick to my favorite 3 crops for a new grower, which would be Haskap, strawberries, and raspberries, because all of those come into production really fast, right? If you get into a tree fruit, you might be waiting 5 years or something, or some of the larger bush fruits. But those are, you plant a strawberry. If it's a day neutral, you get a crop that fall. If it's a Juneberry, you get it the next year. So I would say those, and they also space out your pollination pretty good, because raspberries are blooming at the end of the season, and strawberries are middle, and Haskap tends to be early. So those all would help the bees a little bit. But there's OMAFRA has a lot of general information about growing plants in general. You just have to pick things that are more northern adapted. And a lot of our strawberries and raspberries, if you have, straw mulch on them, you can grow California varieties of the strawberries. And there's a lot of good raspberries from Nova Scotia that we grow here in Saskatchewan that would do well in Algoma.
And what was the impact that you saw in Western Canada with the drought this past year to some of the growers that have orchards, and how are they, I guess, making adaptations in this changing climate?
Yeah, I think fruit trees usually, well, if you have a loam or clay soil, you probably have a bumper crop the first year of a drought, right? And it's the ones that are on the real sandy soil that suffer instantly for a drought. Because like we had great fruit set because the bees were very happy. They didn't have rainy days. But the small plants, I really worried about the ones that I just recently planted to keep them well irrigated. The other thing is with fruit plants, having too much grass competition at a young age really stunts their growth. And in a drought, you want to mow it down, maybe even kill off your grass. They would do better. It's amazing how fast the fruit plants will grow without competition for a while, but that may not always be an option. If you've got a slope or something, you don't want your soil getting washed away. You have to have some grass, but reducing that and mowing it, well, a lot of grass will go dormant in the heat anyway. The Haskap plant tends to be more drought resistant because it grows really fast in the spring, then stops growing the rest of the summer and has waxy leaves. So that tends to be more tolerant than some other species. Sea buckthorn, but that's hard to harvest. There's certain plants that don't mind as much drought.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bob, for joining us at today's conference session. And also thanks to Jenny for joining us as well. Yeah, I guess at this stage, I'll turn it back over to Cameron, I guess, who will give some instruction about day 2 of our conference.
Thanks, Dave. And yeah, thank you, Bob and Jenny, for those presentations. And yeah, I'd actually like to thank all of the speakers who presented today. And of course, I would also like to thank the Chicken Farmers of Ontario, BioEnterprise Canada Corporation, the Cooperation Council of Ontario, and FedNor and the Government of Canada for sponsoring this conference. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you who attended the conference today. We will have another day of excellent presentations tomorrow, and we will start off at 10 a.m. So hope everyone gets a good sleep, and we'll see you in the morning.